On the night of the 15th of August, 1971, in a TV studio in Washington, the lights hit President Richard Nixon's face. On screen, America looked calm tie, straight, voice measured, every sentence wrapped in steel. But behind the camera glass, an entire money system was having its door bolted shut. Not with guns, not with tanks. With one announcement: the United States would temporarily stop converting dollars into gold for foreign governments. Back at Bretton Woods in 1944, the world signed a promise. 1 ounce of gold equals $35, and every other major currency would anchor itself to the dollar. That promise put the USD at the center of the global wheel. But by 1971, the hub was starting to crack. And when the axle breaks, whoever holds the key gets to decide who pays the bill. That night, Nixon didn't just close the gold window. He attached a whole package to it. A freeze on wages and prices, and a 10% import surcharge like a knife placed on the table before negotiations even begin. This wasn't a single decision. It was a bargaining move, broadcast live. And in the next few minutes, the trail will show you why a country can break a promise and somehow walk away stronger. Picture gold like a pressure chamber in a submarine. Bretton Woods was the rule book. When trust pressure rises, you open the valve and swap dollars for gold. But in the 1,960 seconds, dollars flooded the world like water through a broken dam, while America's gold reserves were pulled away like a chain being yanked, link by link. Every time a government showed up with dollars and demanded gold, the system was being tested for leaks. When the London gold pool collapsed in March 1968, it sounded like metal snapping proof the valve was wearing out. Then came Camp David, August 13th to 15th, 1971. A small circle of advisors meeting in a vacation setting, but calculating like a surgical room. They looked at the gold. They looked at the rising demand to exchange dollars for it. And they chose one move: lock the door before it gets ripped off its hinges. But this story doesn't begin in 1971. It begins the moment a promise turns into a weapon, and then the weapon becomes the standard everyone lives under. Now step into the case file with me so you can see the backdrop, the money flows, and the fracture point that opened a whole new era. One sentence to close the case right from the start. America didn't shut the window because it ran out of gold. America shut it to escape the cage Bretton Woods built, and to rewrite what the dollar meant under a new set of rules. Our investigation has 3 stops, 3 connected rooms inside the same Treasury building. The first room is power. In 1944, the world agreed to put the dollar in the middle, because after the war, everyone needed a liquid center to hold the system together. The dollar was tied to gold at $35 an ounce, and the rest of the world tied itself to the dollar. On paper, it looked like stability. In reality, it was a deal built on a blind spot. It only runs smoothly if the U.S. He can do 2 things at once: ship enough dollars out to feed the world, while holding enough gold to keep the promise believable. Those 2 forces pull against each other like 2 hands on the same rope. That internal contradiction has a name: the Triffin dilemma. The more the world needs dollars, the more America must print and export them. But the more it exports, the thinner the gold promise becomes. The second room is the money trail, the footprints in the snow. Dollars leave the U.S., stack up as foreign reserves, then come back as demands for gold. Every demand is a knock on the vault door. And when the knocks turn into pounding, the question stops being, will you convert? It becomes, who gets converted first? And how long until the vault is empty? If we need exact figures, how fast gold was leaving, how big the reserves were in each year, we'll mark them for sourcing. But the machine's logic is already visible. The more dollars sitting outside the border, the greater the pressure on the gold pledge. The third room is the fracture and the bill. August 1971. The gold door is locked. December 1971. The Smithsonian Agreement tries to patch the system, raising the official gold price to $38 an ounce and widening the bands. Then 1973. The fixed rates snap for good, and the major currencies drift into floating exchange rates. And at the end of the tunnel, Jamaica, in 1976, makes the post-Bretton Woods order official, a world of fiat money, still revolving around the dollar as the liquidity center. Now, the investigation has to answer one cold question. In a system where the whole world needs dollars just to breathe, who was really trapped as long as the gold window stayed open? From a distance, Bretton Woods looks like a post-war insurance contract. The world deposits its faith in the dollar, and the United States deposits a promise backed by gold. The real power of that contract isn't in the signatures. It's in what each side can't live without. After 1945, broken economies needed a currency that was clean enough to restart trade, hard enough to stop exchange rate chaos, and abundant enough to rebuild. The dollar fit all three. It was pegged to gold at $35 an ounce, and other currencies pegged to the dollar. 35 looks like a price tag. In reality, it was the pin holding the whole house upright. While that pin held, the dollar became the central pool of liquidity. Reserves held in dollars, payments made in dollars. But every center lives with fear. America's allies feared the system would slide into instability if the dollar wobbled, and America feared being handcuffed by the very mechanism it designed. As long as foreign governments could swap dollars for gold, every dollar the U.S. pushed into the world was another promise laid on the table. And any promise can be called due. Hold on to this rule. Wherever there is a right to convert, there is leverage to pressure. In a moment, that pressure point will come into focus. The Triffin dilemma is a simple, brutal paradox. The more the world needs dollars to trade and store value, the more dollars America must supply. But the more dollars pile up outside U.S. borders, the thinner the faith becomes that those dollars can still be turned into gold. This isn't a story about betrayal. It's a story about structure. Central banks were doing their job managing reserves, minimizing risk, and when the promise started to look weaker, they tested it. They tried to trade dollars for gold. The London gold pool was one attempt to keep that $35 anchor from snapping loose. When it collapsed in March 1968, the system didn't die on the spot. It simply revealed the weld line had cracked. From that moment on, the dollar wasn't treated like an unshakable truth. It was treated like a commitment that could be forced, and on the American side, the problem wasn't only how much gold sat in the vault. The problem was policy freedom. In the 1,960 seconds, pressure rose as the U.S. faced strain from balance of payments, deficits, war spending, and expensive domestic programs. You don't need a spreadsheet to see the logic. The more dollars America had to export to keep the system alive, the greater the risk those dollars would boomerang back and demand gold. Bretton Woods turned a domestic money choice into an international confidence equation. By August 1971, that power equation was dragged into Camp David August 13th to 15th. The decision was compressed like a bullet. Lock the door or watch it get ripped off its hinges. On August 15th, Nixon chose to lock the gold window, and he didn't go alone. He froze wages and prices, then added a 10% import surcharge as a bargaining strike aimed at America's own allies. The unspoken message was clear. The old order survives only if it accepts America's new terms. Now the system's fatal weakness is exposed. The gold conversion door was the place the world could squeeze the center's bloodstream, and once a weakness is exposed, the rules get rewritten by whoever holds the pen. One door locks. A new order begins. The light in this case is in the money trail. Follow each dollar as it leaves America, piles up as reserves, then returns to the gold vault, and you'll see exactly where the system gets tightened. The money trail in this case isn't hidden in a suitcase. It lives in numbers traveling through cables in reserve ledgers, in balance sheets, in gold conversion requests sent by telegram. Things that look harmless on paper, yet strong enough to shake an entire exchange rate empire. The first link starts with the anchor. $35 for 1 ounce of gold. When the world agreed to peg their currencies to the dollar, they also accepted a new habit holding dollars, the way a body holds blood, to keep trade alive. Dollars left the United States not only through goods, but through every international payment flow Bretton Woods encouraged. And every time a dollar left, it didn't vanish. It sat in the vaults of foreign central banks under one label: reserves. That is where the system could be squeezed. The second link is what happens when those reserves swell outside America's borders. On the surface, it looks like stability, bigger reserves, smoother trade, fewer currency swings. But something else grows at the same time: the power to call in the gold promise. Bretton Woods didn't give ordinary people the right to exchange dollars for gold. It gave that right to governments. All it takes is one central bank changing its mind, and the safe reserve instantly becomes a ticket to claim gold. In a system like this, the more tickets exist, the tighter the pressure chamber becomes. That is where the system could be squeezed. The third link is the moment the dollar turns around. In official records, it doesn't show up as betrayal. It shows up as procedure. Bring dollars to the right window. Request gold at the official price. You don't need yearly withdrawal figures to see the effect. Every conversion pulls a little more gold out of the U.S. vault. Every reduction makes the $35 anchor feel weaker, and once the anchor feels weaker, the incentive flips convert sooner, because no one wants to be the last one in line. That's the self-amplifying loop of a promise under stress. That is where the system could be squeezed. The fourth link is the confidence fracture of 1968 when the London gold pool collapsed in March. It was like a control panel flashing red. The mechanism meant to keep gold near the anchor price could no longer contain the strain. Bretton Woods didn't die on the spot, but from that moment everyone inside the system understood one cold truth. If the gold window stayed open forever, the day it got forced open was only a matter of time. And time is the one thing markets never announce in advance. That is where the system could be squeezed. The fifth link is how America began to see the machine it was running. When the dollar is both a domestic currency and the world's reserve currency, international pressure doesn't stay overseas. It slams back into policy at home. In the 1,960 seconds, the U.S. felt the weight of balance of payments, strain, war spending, and costly domestic programs. If we want to land hard conclusions with precise quantities deficit levels, gold outflow rates, reserve shares, we'd need to source them. But even without the exact figures, the clamp is easy to see. The more dollars America must supply to keep the system breathing, the more it places itself in a position where the gold promise can be called. That is where the system could be squeezed. The sixth link is Camp David, August 13th to 15th, 1971, where the money trail meets the power trail. When the stress point is the gold window, the center only has two choices: accept a slow drain until it loses control, or lock the door before pressure becomes the final violent yank. On August 15th, 1971, Nixon announced the new economic policy and temporarily suspended dollar-to-gold convertibility for foreign governments right at Bretton Woods' break line. And he didn't stop there. He froze wages and prices, then added a 10% import surcharge as leverage against allies. On the surface, it was economics. In the structure of this case, it was a message. The new rules will be written from the center. That is where the system could be squeezed. By now, the money trail has exposed a razor-sharp truth. The system didn't collapse because people stopped believing in cooperation. It cracked because the gold promise became a choke point others could tighten, while the dollar, the thing that should have weakened, remained the thing everyone still had to hold just to trade and store value. Once you've watched the dollar leave and return like a boomerang, you've earned the right to dissect the mechanism, because that mechanism is exactly what turned one locked door into a brand new global order. The first mechanism can be said in one sentence, but its consequences lasted half a century. When the gold window shut, the dollar became fiat, but it didn't fall off the throne. It simply switched from a promise backed by metal to a promise backed by a network. Think of Bretton Woods like a suspension bridge. The main cable is gold at $35 an ounce. As long as that cable is there, people believe the bridge won't drop. But in real life, what keeps people crossing every day isn't only the cable, it's the fact that the whole crowd is moving in the same direction. Payments, reserves, commodity pricing, trade contracts. Over time, the system learned to speak USD as its default language. When the gold cable was cut, the bridge should have shaken violently. What happened was colder. People kept walking, because changing direction mid-air was even more dangerous. In the next few minutes, you'll see this clearly. No gold doesn't mean no power. It just means power changed shape. Here's the pivot. Closing the gold window wasn't just ending a service. It was removing the direct chain between the size of the dollar and the gold in the vault. Once the U.S. no longer had to convert dollars into gold for foreign governments, it gained room to run monetary policy and manage exchange rates without a metal constraint around its wrists. But this wasn't magic. It was a risk transfer. When the gold anchor disappears, inflation and currency volatility can rise. If we want to cite exact year-by-year inflation figures, that needs sourcing. The gain was policy freedom. The loss was a slice of stability that had been purchased with gold discipline. The anchor fact you must remember is the date, the 15th of August, 1971. One sentence on television, and one standard was replaced by another. If the first mechanism is about money, the second is about privilege. People call it seigniorage, or the softer phrase, exorbitant privilege, the U.S. can issue debt in the very currency the world needs to pay, to trade, and to store reserves. We should be careful here. If we want to quantify the advantage, how many points it cuts, borrowing costs, or how much net wealth it transfers, those claims need hard sources. But the power structure is visible just from the logic of the case. Treat the dollar like an entry ticket to the global economy. When oil, machinery, raw materials, and major contracts are priced or settled in dollars, if we want to claim this as universal for every commodity that also needs sourcing, then demand for dollars doesn't come only from America. It comes from the desire to function normally in international trade. So even after the dollar stops converting into gold, many countries can't walk away overnight. Not because they love it, because their accounting systems, payment rails, and reserve management have been trained around it. That's the soft trap of a standard. No handcuffs, but a heavy cost to exit. And when the world needs that ticket, the ticket printer has a strategic edge. It can issue more tickets in the form of treasury bills, bonds, public debt, and global markets will still absorb a portion simply because they need dollars to operate. Not unlimited, not free, not without pushback. But it creates a one-way channel in crisis moments. Instead of being drained through gold conversions until control is lost, the U.S. shifts to selling debt in the central currency. That's the twist. Closing the gold window can be read as a kind of soft default on the gold promise, yet it opens a more flexible way to keep the center. One small detail captures the change in shape. In December 1971, the Smithsonian Agreement raised the official gold price to $38 an ounce, an admission the dollar had weakened against gold. While politics tried to keep the dollar at the center anyway, then the market forced it further. If you want to see the mechanism acting like a weapon, go back to the leverage baked into the August 15 package, the 10% import surcharge. That number wasn't just about trade, it was a signal of power. The U.S. was telling its allies, exchange rates and rules are no longer purely technical bargaining. They're geopolitical bargaining chips. When you're both the issuer of the central currency and a massive consumer market, you can turn domestic policy into international leverage. At that point, the mechanism stops being abstract. It has the shape of a button and the sound of a sentence spoken on television. But every mechanism has a cost. Once the dollar was freed from gold, the world stepped into an era where exchange rates could slide faster and shocks could spread wider. Bretton Woods was a sealed room where leaks could be patched through agreement. Post-Bretton Woods is a windy corridor, doors open, drafts everywhere, and each country has to learn how to stand on its own. The long bill, who pays through inflation, who pays through volatility, who pays through balance of payments, crises, if we want to tell it with precise numbers by period, that needs sourcing. For this case, what matters more is seeing the engine switch. From a gold anchor to a network anchor, from metal-backed commitment to liquidity-driven necessity. Once you've opened the mechanism, you can see why the warning lights didn't stop in 1968, and why after 1971, every attempt to patch the system only made the escalation faster. After the crack in 1968, the system didn't collapse overnight. It simply changed state, from stable because people believed, to stable because people forced it. And in money, forced usually means you're already counting down. The first step up the ladder was the warning phase, a chain of signals that everyone in the engine room could hear, but pretended not to. Through the 1,960 seconds, the Triffin contradiction stopped being theory and became a daily rhythm for central banks. Dollars outside the United States swelled like water rising behind a dam, while the gold conversion window sat there like a cold invitation. In March 1968, the London gold pool broke, not with an explosion, but with the sound of a lock dropping. That's the anchor fact to keep in your head. Because after that moment, everything takes on the color of move before you get trapped. And once confidence turns into get there early or get nothing, a promise-based system starts weakening itself without a single shot fired. Here's the quiet twist. Bretton Woods was built to prevent panic, yet the very feature meant to guarantee stability, the right to convert into gold, could feed panic the moment trust thinned. One more step, and warning becomes action. The second step was financial action, not press conferences, but decisions made in rooms with no audience. In mid-August 1971, Camp David became the lock room of a global treasury. August 13th to 15th, a small group weighed what every center of power fears most: losing control. If the gold window stayed open, every rise in pressure forced the U.S. into the same choice: convert or don't convert, and that choice would repeat until the day conversion became impossible. So they locked the door while they could still call it policy, not accident. On August 15th, 1971, Nixon announced the new economic policy and suspended dollar-to-gold convertibility for foreign governments, the breakpoint of Bretton Woods. But the sharp edge was what came with it: a wage and price freeze, and a 10% import surcharge. That 10% was a clinch move. It turned money into trade leverage. It turned exchange rate stability into a bargaining table. And the promise is simple. Right after the lock clicks shut, you'll see how they try to patch the system and why the patch can't survive the pull. The third step was panic response, not necessarily screaming, but markets and governments moving as if the floor had suddenly tilted. In December 1971, The Smithsonian Agreement arrived as an attempt to preserve the old shape, raising the official gold price to $38 an ounce and widening the trading bands. A way of admitting the dollar had to step back so the structure could keep standing. But the very act of adjusting was the signal. The anchor wasn't an anchor anymore. It was something being dragged. Smithsonian could exist on paper, but market pressure kept building. By February to March 1973, the fixed rate order broke in practice, and major currencies moved into floating exchange rates. That's the second anchor fact. 1973 wasn't a speech. It was the moment reality outran coordination. And here the paradox becomes visible. Once gold leaves the stage, you'd expect the dollar to lose the lead role. But because liquidity, settlement, and reserves still revolved around the dollar, the world couldn't rewrite the script overnight. If we want to cite exact inflation paths or volatility levels year by year, we'd need sources. But the logic of the reaction is already enough. When the anchor is cut, everything has to learn how to drift. And in that new water, there's a moment when power shows itself most clearly, not when the system is designed, but when it's bent to survive. Once the gold door is locked, what remains is a single question. Who holds the handle of the new order, and which way will they turn it? Some moments in history don't need long explanations. One sentence is enough, and the whole world hears the click of a lock closing. The 15th of August 1971. In a Washington TV studio, the clock seemed to slow down, as if it understood this was the kind of moment you're not allowed to tremble in. Nixon stared straight into the lens and said what the Bretton Woods system had spent years trying to avoid saying out loud. The United States would temporarily suspend the conversion of dollars into gold for foreign governments. In one sentence, the promise of $35 an ounce was left hanging in midair. No glass shattered, just a kind of silence that tells you the lock on the rules has been changed. Anchor fact, not a long law, not a thick document one line on television on August 15. In that instant, the gold window stopped being a technical feature. It became a border of power. While it stayed open, foreign dollar reserves could turn into gold demands, and every demand forced America to step back another pace. Once it shut, that pressure chain was cut. The stress didn't disappear, it just had to find another exit. Exchange rates, political deals, and then the market. And Nixon didn't only lock the door. He put new conditions on the table. A freeze on wages and prices, and a 10% import surcharge as leverage against allies. Here's the small twist. The strike wasn't only aimed at gold. It was aimed at bargaining power-forcing countries, still anchored to the dollar, to renegotiate inside a framework the U.S. controlled. For a few hours after the announcement, Bretton Woods still existed on paper. But it had lost the one thing that mattered most. The promise was no longer workable. From here on, every patch would be a way to keep the old shape alive long enough for the world to breathe. Smithsonian would try to rebuild discipline by adjusting the gold price and widening the bands like splinting a bone that's already broken. In a few minutes, the bill will show up in exchange rates, and in the way every country is forced to insure itself. This is the real break. The system didn't fall because one country changed its mind. It fell because the center chose to close the door at the exact moment the door had become a fatal weakness. And once that weakness was gone, what remained was the dollar network, liquidity, reserves, settlement still held by the entire world like a life ring in a fast current. Some eras end with cannon fire. This one ended with the click of a lock, and from that click, a new order began to flow cold and fast, like water released from a valve. After that click, the world didn't fall into a void. It fell into something worse. An order that didn't even have a proper name yet, where every country had to learn how to swim without the gold life ring. In December 1971, the Smithsonian Agreement was an attempt to keep the Bretton Woods house standing through one more winter. The official gold price was raised to $38 an ounce, and the trading bands were widened. It was like installing a new lock on a door whose frame had already been bent. On paper, people still called it a system. In the market, it was a temporary deal. The anchor fact is the number 38, an admission the dollar had to step back, even as the center tried to keep control. And then, in early 1973, when major currencies moved to floating rates, the fixed part of Bretton Woods snapped in real life. No funeral, just exchange rate boards jumping like the heartbeat of a body that just lost its sedative. So who won? America won autonomy. It cut the gold obligation and opened policy space that had been strapped down by a metal promise. More than that, America won because the dollar wasn't removed from its role as the central pool of liquidity and reserves, a standard that could swap its backing and still keep the network. And who lost? The countries that put exchange rate stability above everything paid for it in volatility. The countries that used a fixed anchor to enforce domestic discipline had to relearn discipline with different tools. The bill often shows up as inflation and currency swings in the years that follow. If we want to pin it down by period with specific magnitudes, we'd need sources. But the retention twist is already visible. The center broke a promise, then turned the break itself into the foundation of a new standard. By 1976, the Jamaica Accords made the post-Bretton Woods order official. Fiat money, more flexible exchange rates, and gold pushed down from its formal role in the system. Once the rules were legalized, the memory of $35 an ounce slowly became history, but the legacy didn't. A world where the dollar stays at the center even without gold convertibility. For many countries, we can't drop the dollar overnight wasn't belief. It was the cost of exit. And through the fog of consequences, one fact becomes clear. The winner isn't the one holding the most gold. It's the one who can make the world still need their currency to function every day. Once you see that, the lesson of the case stands up on its own, like a cold lamp turning on in a dark room. The 1971 case leaves behind an uncomfortable lesson. Monetary power isn't about whose face is printed on the paper. It's about whether the world has to use that paper just to live normally. When a currency becomes the breathing tube of trade, the promise attached to it can change, and the people who get shocked are usually the ones who believe the rules were permanent. Bretton Woods showed this. The harder the commitment, the easier it is to find a point to squeeze. Post-Bretton Woods showed the other half. The wider the network, the harder it is to replace. Between those two lessons sits a rule for the present watch where liquidity flows, where reserves hide, and where agreements get rewritten in silence. That's how you know who's holding the door handle, even when they're no longer holding gold. If you want to understand this century, don't just watch battlefields. Watch balance sheets, exchange rates, and sentences spoken on television. And if you want more case files like this, money, debt, banks, war, sanctions, subscribe to the channel and I'll see you in the next investigation.